Welcome back to part 2. In the first part, we saw how power is played in the shadows and why fear is a leader's ultimate weapon. But we left off at a dangerous question. How do you commit the necessary sins of power without the world seeing you as a monster? Today, we reveal the face behind the mask. And what about honesty? What did Machiavelli think about truth-telling? He believed being honest is admirable, honorable. People praise honesty, but it's not effective. A cunning leader who can outmaneuver opponents will be more successful than an honest one. Machiavelli says, "For a great leader, lying is acceptable. Breaking your word is acceptable. Deceiving people is acceptable. Betraying them is acceptable. Even stabbing them in the back is acceptable when circumstances change." He argued that situations evolve constantly. What's true today might not be true tomorrow, so your commitments should adapt accordingly. This isn't ethical, this isn't moral, but to hold power and build a great nation, this is what's required. Machiavelli says, people will lie to you, so what obligation do you have to tell them the truth? By remaining honest, you're giving your opponents an advantage. That's not virtuous, that's stupid. And the deception goes deeper. Machiavelli says you don't actually need virtuous qualities, but you must appear to have them. Winning people's admiration requires two things: appearances and results. Most people judge a leader only by their public image. Very few see what happens behind closed doors. So people will evaluate you based on what they observe, not what they don't experience. Your words should sound inspired by virtue, because people judge you on that basis. But simultaneously, they'll judge your achievements. And results don't always come from honesty or kindness. Look around at our world today. Open Instagram, watch the news. How many influencers or gurus present themselves as spiritual guides on camera? Why? Because Machiavelli was right. The public isn't interested in your truth. They're interested in your image. What appears successful sells. Machiavelli decoded this marketing principle 500 years before social media existed. Now, at this point, Machiavelli probably sounds like a villain, and in some ways he is. But if you dismiss him as merely evil, you'll miss his profound truths. Insights so deep, they'll make you uncomfortable. Machiavelli rejected Christianity as a way to deal with life's problems. He writes, "Many people believe that the world is governed by God and fortune, and they cannot control outcomes." In these words, Machiavelli is mocking the idea of God controlling everything. And in a way, this is tremendously inspirational. He's saying, you have control over your life, not God, not fate, you. Now go do something with that control. Machiavelli's philosophy contains two crucial concepts: virtù and fortuna. Virtù isn't virtue in the moral sense. It's about success versus failure, strength versus weakness. It is whatever gives you the power to act: talent, boldness, cunning, intelligence. With virtù, you can become truly great, and fortuna? Simply luck. Machiavelli says fortuna basically determines half of what happens to us. The other half depends on us, on our virtù. Imagine a river that regularly floods, destroying a village. That's fortuna, uncontrollable fate. But we can build dams and levees so that when the river floods, people stay safe. Fortune only has power where you allow it. Through preparation, through virtù, you can at least be ready to face fortune when it arrives. That's virtù meeting fortuna. A person can succeed today doing X, Y, and Z, and fail tomorrow doing those exact same things because fortuna changed. Adapt or die. Machiavelli also believed there's a beast inside every human being, an animal nature. No matter how moral we appear externally, something else lurks inside. Maybe he was ahead of his time. Psychologist Carl Jung later called this the shadow. Sigmund Freud called it the subconscious. Machiavelli says, don't suppress this beast, but don't let it control you either. Learn from it. Be like the lion who can scare off wolves. Be like the fox who's cunning enough to avoid any trap. If you only play by human rules, by moral constraints, you'll always be limited. But Machiavelli's most powerful insight, his most chillingly accurate observation, is this. There's a massive gap between the world as it should be and the world as it is. And if you conduct yourself according to how the world should be, you're writing your own destruction. The world isn't utopia. There are traps, lies, threats, dangers. Live according to the world as it is, not as you think it should be. You need to function in ways that give you resilience against these realities. This single insight is the core of his entire philosophy. Now, up to this point, everything seems consistent. But when we try putting Machiavelli's principles into practice, problems emerge. And this is where the story twists. Remember I told you Machiavelli wrote The Prince for Lorenzo de' Medici? It was a gift. Basically, a job application. And remember, he did this for the same Medici family that had imprisoned him, tortured him, and exiled him. So what happened? Machiavelli didn't get the job. Lorenzo probably never even read the book. But even if he had, Machiavelli wouldn't have been hired. Why? Think about it. Machiavelli should have understood what his ideas meant in practice. But by publishing those very ideas, he destroyed his own career. Look at what he advocates. Deceit, backstabbing, cruelty, opportunism, constantly changing allegiances. Why would you keep this man in your inner circle? Why would you give him any position of power? When these principles get publicly broadcast, they become incredibly antisocial, maybe even counterproductive. After reading The Prince, who would want Machiavelli close to them? Answer: nobody. The fact remains, Machiavelli never achieved any significant position of power after his exile. He never wrote a constitution, never led a revolution. Despite all his theories, his own philosophy didn't benefit him much. Maybe he hid some accomplishments from history, but his legacy remains powerful. When The Prince finally appeared in print, an English cardinal declared it was written by the finger of Satan. Then Pope Paul IV immediately banned the book. In 1576, a writer named Gentilet firmly established Machiavelli as history's villain. Some people even printed distorted versions of his book to misrepresent him. Gradually, his name became synonymous with wickedness. But the truth is, Machiavelli's thesis was simply this: Christian morals and effective political leadership aren't always compatible. They can't always coexist. Today's leaders often perform morality and act on it when convenient. The reality is, there's always a kind of divorce between ethics and political ambition. Personally, I resist Machiavelli's cynicism. And yet, I can't completely dismiss him either. I avoid his negativity. I would never want to become like Cesare Borgia. Nor would I want a Borgia-like leader ruling over me. I believe people are inherently good. But if I said this to Machiavelli's face, he'd laugh at me. He'd say I'm doing exactly what he warns against, living according to how the world should be. You see, Machiavelli's writing contains a single-minded determination. He doesn't care whether he's a good person or bad person. He doesn't care about God, doesn't care about friends. His philosophy cares about only one thing: power. Maybe there's something admirable in such determination, even if it's not relevant for every person. And here's the point that makes me think hardest. About 1800 years before Machiavelli, there was a man in India named Chanakya. He wrote the Arthashastra. Both discuss diplomacy. Both talk about spies. Both say that sometimes rulers must break moral rules. Machiavelli discovered in Italy what Chanakya had written long ago. These ideas don't belong to any single culture. They're observations about how power actually works. But like every great villain, Machiavelli is dangerous. Subscribing wholesale to his ideas is dangerous. And maybe equally dangerous is ignoring them entirely. You can love Machiavelli or hate him. You can call him a villain or a genius. But one thing you cannot deny: that man wrote what was in people's minds but not on their tongues. He wrote what happens in power's games but never gets discussed publicly. And that's why 500 years later, we are still talking about him. Because some truths are so uncomfortable that ignoring them becomes impossible. the man who understood the game better than anyone still lost. He decoded every rule, predicted every betrayal, and none of it saved him. Which means the scariest lesson isn't in the prince at all. Maybe it's this. You can see the entire chessboard, understand every move, master every tactic, and the game can still devour you anyway. Understanding doesn't guarantee winning. Sometimes the prophet dies in the wilderness. Sometimes clarity is its own curse. Sometimes the person who sees deepest is the one who falls hardest. Machiavelli gave us a mirror. He showed us what power looks like when you strip away the pretty words, the moral performance, and the lies we tell ourselves. He didn't invent evil, he just wrote it down with brutal honesty. And we hated him for it. Not because he was wrong, but because he was right.